For 30 years, Judge Walter Calloway kept a single sheet of paper folded inside his Bible. It was the verdict from a case he was never sure he got right, and on the night a stranger finally knocked on his door, he learned he had been wrong about almost everything. He was 78 years old. He had sent a 19-year-old boy to prison for the rest of his life, and for 3 decades he had told himself the law had done its job. But the law and the truth are not always the same thing. Sometimes they sit on opposite sides of the same river, and a man can spend his whole life on the wrong bank, waiting for a bridge that never comes. This is the story of the night the bridge finally appeared. Walter Calloway had been a circuit judge in Marion County for 26 years. Before that, he had been a prosecutor for 9, and before that, a poor farm kid from a town called Cedar Hollow, who learned to read by the light of a kerosene lamp because his father said a man with words in his head could never be cheated by a man with money in his pocket. He believed that. He believed in the law the way other men believed in church. He thought the two were close cousins. The courthouse in Marion County was built in 1911 out of limestone the color of old bone. Walter had walked up its 41 steps every working morning for a quarter of a century, his briefcase in one hand and his coffee in the other. And he had believed every single time that he was walking towards something clean. Justice was supposed to be clean. That was the whole idea. He retired at 68. The county threw him a dinner at the VFW hall with a sheet cake and a plaque, and the district attorney gave a speech about how Judge Calloway had never once been overturned on appeal, not in 26 years on the bench. People clapped. Walter smiled and shook the hands and ate the cake, and the whole time, in the back of his mind, there was a boy named Daniel Pruitt, sitting in a cell 200 miles away, 19 when Walter sentenced him, 46 by the night the cake was cut. He never forgot the name. A judge sees 1,000 faces. Most of them blur together like rain on a windshield, but some of them stay. Daniel Pruitt stayed. It happened in the spring of 1994. A man named Carl Mercer, a respected hardware store owner in the town of Brennan, was found dead in the back room of his shop. He had been struck once on the back of the head with a steel pry bar. The cash drawer was empty, the back door was open, and 11 feet from the body, the police found a wallet belonging to 19-year-old Daniel Pruitt, a kid who swept the floors of that hardware store 3 afternoons a week for $4 an hour. Daniel said he had dropped the wallet that morning. He said he had gone home at 5 o'clock like always, eaten supper with his mother, and gone to bed. He said he never went back. He had no alibi a jury would trust because his only witness was his own mother. And a mother will say anything to save her son. Everyone knows that. Everyone always says that. The prosecution built a clean little house out of the wallet and the cash drawer and the fact that Daniel had once been heard, at 16, telling another boy that old man Mercer kept too much money in that drawer for a man so cheap. 16 years old. A dumb thing a teenager says. But it came back 3 years later wearing a suit and a motive. The jury was out for 4 hours. They came back with guilty. And Walter Calloway, 49 years old then, certain of himself in a way only a man who has never been truly wrong can be certain, sentenced Daniel Pruitt to life in prison. He remembered the boy's face when the sentence came down. Daniel didn't scream, he didn't curse. He just looked up at Walter with a kind of quiet that didn't belong on a 19-year-old, and he said 5 words. Walter heard them in his sleep for 30 years. "I'll be here when you understand." That was all. The bailiffs took him out, the court moved on to the next case, and life, the way it does, kept going. But here's the thing nobody knew. Not the district attorney, not Walter's wife, not the appellate court that affirmed the conviction without a single dissent. From the moment the jury read that verdict, Walter Calloway was not sure. Something in the case never sat right. It was a splinter under the skin of his certainty, too small to see, too deep to dig out, and it festered there for 30 years. The wallet. It was always the wallet. If Daniel Pruitt had murdered Carl Mercer and emptied the cash drawer, why would he leave his own wallet 11 feet from the body? A man clever enough to wait until closing, clever enough to come through the back, clever enough to take only the cash and nothing traceable, does not drop his own name on the floor like a calling card. It made no sense. It had never made sense. But the jury didn't care about sense. They cared about the wallet being there. And a judge does not get to overrule a jury because a detail itches. So Walter buried it. He told himself the law had spoken. He told himself that 12 people had looked at the same facts and reached the same place. And who was he to trust a feeling over a verdict? He told himself 100 comfortable things across 30 years, and not one of them ever made the splinter stop hurting. He remembered the trial better than he remembered most of his own life. He remembered the way the prosecutor, a sharp, ambitious man named Gerald Voss, who later ran for state senate on his conviction record, had held up that wallet for the jury like a preacher holding up scripture. He remembered the boy's lawyer, a tired, court-appointed man with too many cases and too little fight, who never once asked the obvious question, never once stood up and said to that jury, "Ladies and gentlemen, ask yourselves why a guilty man would leave his own name on the floor." Nobody asked it. Walter had wanted to ask it himself, from the bench, and a judge does not get to do the defense's job for it. And so he had sat there in his black robe, with the question burning a hole in his chest, and he had said nothing. He remembered Daniel's mother, too. A small woman in a Sunday dress that had been pressed so many times, the fabric had gone shiny at the seams. She sat in the second row every single day of that trial, with her hands folded in her lap and her chin up, and when the verdict came, she did not cry out. She just lowered her head slow, the way a person lowers their head into a wind they know they cannot walk against. She died 9 years later, Walter would learn, having visited her son every other Sunday for 9 years without missing one, riding a Greyhound bus 4 hours each way because she never learned to drive. The thing about a wrongful conviction is that it does not ruin one life. It ruins a family the way a flood ruins a town. Not all at once, but house by house, year by year, until there is nothing left standing where a whole world used to be. Daniel lost his freedom. His mother lost her son and her health and finally her life. And a 14-year-old girl named Ruth lost her brother and her childhood in the same afternoon and grew up the daughter of a family the whole town whispered about, the sister of the boy who killed Carl Mercer, a sentence she had to wear like a coat she never got to take off. Walter had done all of that, with a gavel and a sentence and a silence. He had told himself for 30 years that the jury did it, that the law did it, that he had only been the man who read the result. But a judge is not a clerk. A judge is the last human being standing between a verdict and a life, and Walter had stepped aside. His wife, Eleanor, died in the autumn of his 75th year. 49 years of marriage, and then a hospital room, and the long, slow quiet after. After she was gone, the house got very large and very still. Walter found himself talking to rooms. He found himself more and more sitting in his study at night with the lamp on and the case file out, the photocopied case file he was technically not supposed to have kept, reading the same pages he had read 1,000 times, looking for the thing he had missed. Because by then he had stopped pretending. By then, alone in that big quiet house, he could admit the truth to himself. He thought he had convicted an innocent man. He had thought it for 30 years, and he had done nothing. That was the part that ate him. Not the doubt. A judge can live with doubt. It was the doing nothing. He had robes and reputation and a clean record, and he had been afraid. Afraid of being the man who said he was wrong. Afraid of what it would cost the office he had loved, the law he had served. He had let a boy grow old behind concrete, because admitting a mistake felt like setting fire to the only thing Walter had ever believed in. He was 78 now. His hands shook when he poured coffee. The doctor had used the word heart in a sentence Walter didn't like the shape of. He did not have the luxury of 30 more years to be a coward in. It was the second week of March when the knock came. A cold night, late, near 11, sleet ticking against the windows. Walter was in his study with the file, as he was most nights, when he heard it. 3 slow knocks on the front door. He sat very still. Old men living alone do not expect knocks at 11 at night, and the ones they get are rarely good news. He went to the door. He was not a fearful man, but his hand paused on the latch a moment before he opened it. On the porch, under the yellow porch light, stood a woman he did not know. 60s, maybe. A worn wool coat, gray hair pulled back, a face that had cried recently and stopped only because it ran out. She held a manila envelope against her chest with both hands, the way a person holds something they have carried a very long way. "Judge Calloway?" she said. Her voice shook. "Judge Walter Calloway?" "I'm retired," he said, "but yes, "That's me." "My name is Ruth Pruitt," she said. "I'm Daniel's sister. I was 14 when you sent my brother to prison." The night seemed to go very quiet. The sleet kept ticking, but Walter stopped hearing it. "Daniel died 11 days ago," Ruth said, "in the prison infirmary. Cancer. He was 49 years old. He spent 30 years inside for a thing he didn't do, and he died in a county he was born free in. And you are the man who put him there." Walter Calloway had heard terrible things said to him in courtrooms by men he had sentenced. He had been threatened, cursed, spat at. None of it had ever landed the way those plain words landed on that cold porch. He felt something in his chest go down like a stone in deep water. "I think," he said, and his voice came out old and small, "you had better come in out of the cold." She sat in Eleanor's chair by the fireplace because it was the only other chair in the study, and Walter built up the fire with hands that were not steady, and for a while, neither of them spoke. Then Ruth Pruitt set the manila envelope on the small table between them and slid it toward him. "He wrote you letters," she said, "for 30 years. He never sent them. He said you weren't ready to read them, and then he said maybe he wasn't ready to send them, and then he ran out of time. These are the last ones. And this," she tapped the envelope, "this is the one that matters." Walter opened it. Inside were perhaps a dozen folded pages, prison stationery, the handwriting growing shakier across the years the way his own had, and on top, a single page, newer than the rest, written in a hand so weak the letters barely held their shape. He read it, and as he read it, 30 years of comfortable lies fell out from under him like a trap door. To understand what was in that letter, you have to go back to the spring of 1994, to the things the jury never heard, the things Daniel Pruitt knew and could never prove. Daniel had not killed Carl Mercer, but he knew who had. He had known from the first week. Carl Mercer's hardware store was not just a hardware store. In the back room behind a false panel, Daniel had once seen by accident while looking for a box of nails, Carl Mercer ran a quiet little business lending money to men who couldn't get it from a bank. Farmers behind on their notes, men with gambling debts, men who needed cash and couldn't afford to be seen needing it. Carl charged them interest that would make a loan shark blush, and he kept his records in a green ledger in that false panel, and he kept the cash that fed the operation in that very drawer everyone assumed was just the store's daily take. Daniel knew because Daniel swept the floors and emptied the trash and kept his eyes open. And one afternoon 3 weeks before the murder, he had seen a man come out of that back room white-faced and furious, and he had heard that man say to Carl Mercer, "You'll get your money when I have it, and if you go to my wife again, I will put you in the ground." The man was named Roy Stutz, and Roy Stutz was the brother-in-law of the sheriff. Daniel was 19. He was poor. His father was gone and his mother cleaned houses, and his sister was 14. When the police found his wallet by the body and the sheriff's own brother-in-law was the man with the motive, Daniel did the math a frightened poor boy does. He understood, the way poor people always understand, that the truth would not save him. The truth would only get his mother's house burned down and his sister hurt. So when his court-appointed lawyer told him to keep quiet and let the system work, Daniel kept quiet. He gambled that 12 strangers would see that the wallet made no sense. He lost that bet, and he spent 30 years paying it. But here's what the letter said, the new page on top, the one written 11 days before he died. Roy Stutz had died that winter, an old man in a nursing home, his mind half gone. And on his deathbed, with nothing left to protect and a daughter sitting beside him who had spent her whole life ashamed of him, Roy Stutz had confessed. He had told his daughter everything. How he had owed Carl Mercer $4,000. How he had gone to the store that night to plead for more time. How Carl had laughed at him and threatened to tell Roy's wife about the gambling. And how Roy had picked up the pry bar off the workbench in a blind animal panic and swung it once. How he had taken the cash to make it look like a robbery. How he had seen the boy's wallet on the floor where Daniel had dropped it that morning. And how, God forgive him, he had left it there. He had not planted it. He had simply seen a way to walk free and taken it. And a 19-year-old boy had paid for the rest of his life. Roy's daughter had written it all down. She had signed it. She had taken it, terrified, to a lawyer, and the lawyer had taken it to the prison. It had reached Daniel Pruitt's hands 4 days before he died. 4 days. After 30 years, the truth arrived 4 days early to do him no good at all. And Daniel Pruitt, dying, 49 years old, had used some of the last strength in his body to write one final letter. Not to the lawyer, not to the newspapers, to the judge. Walter read it twice. Then he read it a third time because his eyes kept filling and the words kept swimming away from him. "Your Honor," it began, and Walter flinched at the word because he had not felt honorable in 30 years. "I am told I do not have long. They found the truth too late to give me back my life, but not too late to give you back your peace, and that is the only thing I have left to give anyone. So I am giving it to you. I want you to know I never hated you. I watched you during my trial. I saw your face when they put my wallet into evidence. I saw that you knew. You knew it made no sense, the same as I did. The difference between us was only that you had the power to do something with knowing, and you were afraid of what it would cost you. I forgave you for that a long time ago, because I learned in here that fear makes cowards of better men than you and me both. I told you once I would be here when you understood. I meant it. I am not angry that it took you this long. I am only asking one thing. When you understand, do not waste the understanding the way I wasted my appeals. Use it. There is a boy in this place right now, 2 cells down, who did not do what they say he did. I know it the way I knew about myself. His name is Marcus Bell. He is 20 years old. Nobody is coming for him. Be the judge I always believed you could have been. The night you sentenced me, if you had only been a little less afraid, be that man for him. That is all I want. That is everything I want. Daniel Pruitt. Walter Calloway sat in his study with the fire burning down and the sleet ticking on the glass, and he wept the way old men weep, silently, the tears running down into the creases of a face that had spent a lifetime keeping itself composed for a courtroom. Ruth Pruitt watched him. She had come, she would say later, expecting to hate him to his face. She had rehearsed it for 11 days. But you cannot easily hate a broken old man crying over your dead brother's forgiveness. The hate she had carried like a stone all those years did not vanish, but it shifted. It became something heavier and quieter and harder to name. He was a good man, she said. My brother. Prison didn't make him bitter. I don't know how. They took everything from him, and he came out of every visit asking about me, about Mama before she passed, about whether I was happy. 30 years, and he never once asked me to be angry for him. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. He just kept saying, the truth doesn't die in the dark. It only sleeps. It always wakes up. It just doesn't always wake up in time. Walter looked at the letter in his shaking hands. 30 years. A boy who had known the truth and stayed silent to protect his family. A judge who had suspected the truth and stayed silent to protect his pride. And only one of them had had a good reason. He thought of the 41 limestone steps. He thought of all the mornings he had climbed them, believing he was walking towards something clean. He understood now that the steps had never been the problem. The law was a fine machine. But a machine only does what the frightened men running it allow it to do. And Walter had been one of the frightened men. And he had told himself for 3 decades that his fear was prudence. Marcus Bell, he said. Ruth looked up. The boy in the letter, Walter said. Marcus Bell. Tell me everything Daniel told you about him. For the first time since she had knocked on his door, something moved across Ruth Pruitt's tired face that was not grief. It was surprise. And underneath the surprise, faint and uncertain, the smallest beginning of something that might one day grow into hope. You'd help him, she said. After all this time, you'd actually do it. I sent your brother to prison for a murder he didn't commit, Walter said. And I knew. He's right. I knew, and I was afraid, and I let it happen. And then I let 30 years happen on top of it. I cannot give Daniel back one single day. There is no court in this country that can undo what I did to him. He folded the letter carefully, the way you fold something holy. But he didn't write me this to make me sorry. A sorry old man is no use to anybody. He wrote me this to put me to work. So tell me about Marcus Bell, and then tell me the name of the lawyer who has Roy Stutz's confession. Because the first thing we are going to do, before anything else, is clear your brother's name. Posthumously, in open court, in the same county that convicted him, with the same newspapers that called him a killer sitting in the front row. Daniel Pruitt is going to be exonerated. I'm going to stand up in that courtroom myself and say what I should have said 30 years ago. Ruth Pruitt began, very quietly, to cry again. But it was a different kind of crying. What happened over the next 11 months would become, eventually, a story the whole county knew. But it did not start as a story. It started as an old man making phone calls. Walter Calloway had been retired for 10 years, but a circuit judge of 26 years standing knows where every bone in the county is buried, and knows which doors open to a knock, and which open only to a shove. He started with the lawyer who held Roy Stutz's signed confession, a young public defender named Aaron Webb, who had inherited the document and had no idea what to do with it, no money to fight with, and a caseload that would have buried a younger man. When Walter called him and said, "My name is Walter Calloway. I'm the judge who sentenced Daniel Pruitt, and I would like to help you set the record straight," there was a silence on the line so long that Walter thought the call had dropped. "Sir," Aaron Webb finally said, "I have been trying to get someone to take this seriously for 2 months. Why on God's earth would the judge who convicted him be the one to help me?" "Because," Walter said, "I am the only man left alive who has a debt to pay on it, and I intend to pay it before I die." They met the next morning. Aaron Webb came to the big quiet house with a box of files, and Walter cleared off the dining room table he and Eleanor had eaten at for 49 years, and the two of them spread out 30 years of wrongful imprisonment across it. The wallet, the cash drawer, the green ledger that had never been found because nobody had ever looked for it, Roy Stutz's signed and witnessed confession, the original trial transcript, in which a younger Walter Calloway could be seen, if you knew how to read between the lines, all but begging the jury to notice what he himself had been too cowardly to act on. It took 11 months because justice, even when everyone finally wants it, moves like a glacier. There were motions to file, and a district attorney to convince, and a sitting judge who did not love the idea of a famous predecessor coming back to announce a 30-year-old mistake on the county's record. There were nights Walter's heart gave him trouble and he had to stop. There were mornings he woke up certain he would die before it was finished, and the truth would go back to sleep. There were days the district attorney's office fought him, not out of cruelty, but out of the simple institutional terror of admitting that the machine had eaten an innocent man, and nobody had stopped it. There was a young assistant DA who told Walter, across a conference table, that reopening a 30-year-old case would, quote, undermine public confidence in the courts. Walter had looked at him a long moment. "Son," he said, "the courts convicted a boy who swept floors for $4 an hour and kept him for 30 years and let him die of cancer in a cell. If the public still has confidence in that, the public has not been paying attention. The only thing that rebuilds confidence in a court is a court with the spine to say when it was wrong. Hiding the mistake doesn't protect the law. It just makes the law a liar in a nicer suit." There was a night in the 7th month when Walter's heart finally did the thing the doctor had warned about, and he woke up on the floor of his study with the case file scattered around him and the phone too far to reach, and he lay there in the dark for an hour before he could pull himself up. He did not tell Ruth. He did not tell Aaron. He took his pills, and he drank his coffee with both hands, and the next morning he was back at the dining room table where he and Eleanor had eaten for 49 years, reading the Green Ledger subpoena one more time. He had decided something on that floor, in that dark hour. He had decided that if the truth and his own death were going to race to the finish, he was going to make sure the truth won, even by a nose, even if he had to drag it across the line and fall down dead on the other side. But the truth, this time, did not go back to sleep. Walter Calloway would not let it. He drove the 200 miles to the prison where Daniel had died, and he stood in the warden's office, and he got the records on Marcus Bell, the 20-year-old in the next cell, and he found, exactly as Daniel had promised, a conviction built on a single witness who had since recanted and a public defender who had spent 40 minutes on the case. He put Aaron Webb on that one, too. He paid for it out of his own pocket, the savings he and Eleanor had set aside for a retirement she did not live to spend. And on a bright, cold morning in February, in the limestone courthouse in Marion County, up the same 41 steps Walter Calloway had climbed for a quarter of a century, the case of the state versus Daniel Pruitt was reopened. The courtroom was full. Ruth Pruitt sat in the front row in a new coat she could not really afford because she had decided her brother would not be exonerated while she sat there looking like the county had beaten her. Aaron Webb sat at the defense table that should have had a defendant at it 30 years ago and didn't, and never would again. The newspapers were there. So was the daughter of Roy Stutz, who had driven 4 hours to sit in the back and watch the truth she had set loose finally land. And Walter Calloway, 79 years old now, his hands shaking, his heart uncertain, stood up not as a judge, but as a witness. And he was sworn in, and he told the whole truth. He told them about the wallet. He told them it had never made sense, and that he had known it had never made sense on the very day he sentenced the boy. He told them he had suspected an innocent man was being convicted, and that he had said nothing, done nothing, because he had been afraid of what it would cost his reputation, and his record, and his clean, unblemished name. He did not soften it. He did not let himself off. An old man who has finally decided to tell the truth has no use for mercy on himself. I was given a robe and a gavel, he told that silent courtroom, and I was given the trust of this county. And the most important thing that trust required of me was the courage to be wrong out loud. And on the single most important day of Daniel Pruitt's life, I did not have it. He was 19 years old. He looked at me from that table, right there, and he told me he would be here when I understood. He has been gone 11 months. He understood me 30 years before I understood myself. I am here today to do the only thing left that I can do. I am here to say that this court convicted an innocent man, that I knew and was silent, and that the failure was not the jury's and not the law's. It was mine. Daniel Pruitt was innocent. He always was. And I am sorry. I am so deeply sorry. And I know that sorry is the cheapest word in any language, and I have spent 11 months and every dollar I have trying to make it cost me something, because Daniel taught me that an understanding you don't pay for isn't worth anything at all. The judge on the bench that day was a woman in her 50s named Patricia Hollis, who had been a law student when Walter Calloway was at the height of his career, and who had, in fact, become a judge partly because of a speech he gave once about justice being clean. She was crying. She did not bother to hide it. When Walter finished, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the old radiator ticking against the cold. Daniel Pruitt was exonerated that morning. The conviction was vacated. The record was corrected. It was 30 years and 11 months too late to do Daniel a single hour of good. But Ruth Pruitt stood up when they read it, and she turned around to face the courtroom full of people who had spent 30 years believing her brother was a murderer, and she said, in a clear, strong voice, "His name was Daniel. He swept floors, and he loved his mother, and he forgave the man who failed him. Remember it right this time." And they did. The newspaper that had called him a killer in 1994 ran his exoneration on the front page, 1,100 words, with the photograph Ruth gave them of Daniel at 18, before any of it, grinning on the porch of a house that was gone now, his whole unspent life still ahead of him in the picture. But Walter Calloway was not finished. Because there was still a 20-year-old named Marcus Bell, 2 cells down from where Daniel had died. And Daniel had not written that letter so that Walter could feel clean again. He had written it to put a frightened man to work, and Walter intended to stay at work until the work was done. It took another 7 months. Marcus Bell's case was thinner than Daniel's had been, the recanted witness easier to break, and with Walter Calloway's name attached to the appeal, doors that had been shut for 2 years swung open. On a warm September afternoon, Marcus Bell walked out of the same prison Daniel Pruitt had died in. 21 years old now, blinking in sunlight he had not felt unfiltered in 3 years. And the first face he saw was an old man in a gray coat leaning on a cane, who had driven 200 miles to be standing at that gate. "You don't know me," Walter said. "I know who you are," Marcus said. "Everybody in there knows who you are. Daniel talked about you, the judge who came back." He looked at the old man for a long moment. "He said you'd come. Right before he died, he told me, there's a judge, and one day he's going to understand something. And when he does, he's going to come for you." I didn't believe him. Why would I believe him? "He believed it enough for both of you," Walter said. "Come on, son. There's somebody who wants to meet you." Daniel's sister made supper. She doesn't take no for an answer. It runs in the family. That supper was the strangest table Walter Calloway had ever sat at, and the best. Ruth Pruitt cooked the way her mother had, fried chicken and collard greens and biscuits, and she set 5 places out of habit and then quietly took one away, the place that would have been Daniel's, and nobody said anything about the empty chair because everyone at that table understood it was the most important seat in the room. Marcus Bell ate like a boy who had not tasted real food in 3 years, which he had not. And at one point he stopped, fork halfway up, and looked around at the warm kitchen and the steam on the window and the old judge passing him the biscuits. And he put the fork down and put his face in his hands. And Ruth got up without a word and stood behind him with her hands on his shoulders until it passed. She had done that for her brother on visiting days for 30 years. She knew exactly how long to stand there. She knew not to say anything. Some kindnesses don't need words. They just need a person who refuses to leave the room. What you bury in the dark, the morning sun will find. Roy Stutz buried it for 30 years, and it found him on his deathbed and would not let him die in peace until he said it out loud. Walter Calloway buried his own knowing for just as long, and it found him on a sleeting March night in the shape of a tired woman with a manila envelope. And it would not let him die until he had dug it back up and done something with it at last. He lived 2 more years. His heart, which the doctor had been so worried about, turned out to have a good deal of fight left in it once Walter finally gave it something worth beating for. He spent those 2 years working with Aaron Webb and a handful of young lawyers on cases nobody else would touch. The thin convictions, the single witness cases, the poor and the forgotten, and the railroaded. They called it the Pruitt Project because Walter insisted, and in 2 years they freed 4 more people who should never have been inside. Ruth Pruitt ran the office. Marcus Bell, who turned out to have a quick mind and a gift for finding the one wrong thing in a stack of paper, went back to school on Walter's dime and was halfway to a paralegal certificate when the old man finally passed. Walter died in his sleep in the big house, in the chair by the fireplace, with Daniel Pruitt's last letter folded inside his Bible where the verdict used to be. He had taken the verdict out and burned it the night Ruth first came. He didn't need it anymore. He had finally read the other side of it. At his funeral, the courtroom of the limestone courthouse was opened up for the service because no church in the county was big enough. Judge Patricia Hollis spoke. Aaron Webb spoke. And then, to the surprise of everyone, Ruth Pruitt stood up, an old woman herself by then, and she walked to the front and she said only this. My brother told a judge 30 years ago that he'd be here when the judge understood. He waited his whole life and he never got to see it. But I did. I got to watch a frightened man stop being frightened. I got to watch the truth wake up. It woke up too late for Daniel, and I made my peace with God a long time ago about that. But it woke up. And 4 other families have their people home tonight because of it. So don't any of you sit there feeling sad. My brother won. It just took him dying, and it took an old man finally finding his nerve, but Daniel Pruitt won. The truth doesn't die in the dark. Remember that. It only sleeps. Some debts are paid in dollars, others are paid in years, and a very few of them, the heaviest ones, the ones a man carries folded up inside his Bible for 30 winters, can only be paid in the one currency that frightened men spend last and hardest. The truth, said out loud, in the light. No matter what it costs and no matter how late it comes. Walter Calloway spent 30 years on the wrong bank of the river, waiting for a bridge. In the end, he learned the bridge was never going to come. He learned that the only way across was to wade into the cold water himself, an old man, alone, afraid, and build it one truth at a time with his own 2 shaking hands. He got across. He just had to nearly run out of life to find the courage to start. And on the other side, waiting, was the answer to the only question that had ever really mattered to him. The question he had been too afraid to ask out loud for 30 years. Had he gotten it wrong? Yes, he had. He had gotten it terribly, unforgivably wrong. But it is never the question that saves a man. It is what he does the morning he finally lets himself hear the answer. If you've stayed with Walter and Daniel all the way to the end, then you already know the thing this story was really about. It was never about a wallet on a hardware store floor. It was about how long a good man can hide from a truth he already knows, and how much it costs the innocent while he hides, and how it is never, ever too late to stop hiding, even when it is far too late to undo the harm. Thank you for staying until the very end. If Daniel's forgiveness moved you, or if Walter's long road back to courage reminded you of someone, tell us in the comments. And if you believe, the way Daniel did, that the truth only sleeps and never dies, then share this story with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Some truths take 30 years to wake up, but when they finally do, the whole county hears them.